The night air over the Hartsfield estate carried the smell of rain and cut grass, and the kind of quiet that never felt peaceful, but heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the mansion, the light was warm but sterile, the kind of golden glow that belonged to magazines, not to people. Clara Johnson moved through it like a shadow trained to leave no trace. Every sound she made, a plate placed gently on the marble counter, a whisper of fabric as she straightened the tablecloth, was absorbed by the vastness of the house. She had been working here for nearly 2 years, long enough to know the rhythm of its emptiness, long enough to tell the difference between the echo of a closing door and the sigh of someone too tired to speak. Her hands were the kind that remembered every surface. They remembered the coarse fabric of her uniform, the cool touch of silver trays, the trembling softness of a child's cheek. They also remembered pain, though she never let that memory show. Beneath the sleeves of her navy blue uniform, faint bruises traced a map of places she no longer dared to explain. She had gotten good at pretending they didn't exist. Every morning she told herself she was fine, and every evening she proved it by surviving another day. Upstairs, in a room that overlooked the manicured gardens, a little girl was crying again. The sound was thin and weary, like a bird beating its wings against glass. Clara paused in the hall, balancing a tray with a bowl of chicken soup and a glass of milk, and listened. She always listened first. It told her what kind of night it would be, how long the child would resist food, how much patience she would need to borrow from a place inside her that was already empty. Sophie Hartsfield had been crying every night for 6 months, since the day her mother's laughter had gone silent. Clara pushed the door open with her shoulder. The room was beautiful in the way hotel rooms are beautiful, designed to impress, not to comfort. Toys lined the shelves, untouched. The window was half open despite the chill, the white curtains breathing in and out with the wind. Sophie sat on her bed clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear, her golden hair tangled from sleep that never came easily. She looked up when Clara entered, eyes swollen, lips trembling. "Hey, Miss Sophie," Clara said softly, her voice low, steady, like a song sung to calm the air itself. "I brought you something warm." "I don't want it," the girl whispered, turning her face toward the window. Clara set the tray down and came closer, not too close. "You don't have to eat it all," she said. "Just a few bites. You remember what we said last time? Every spoonful is a little piece of strength." Sophie didn't answer, but her shoulders shook. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the blanket. "You know, when I was your age," she began quietly, "my grandma used to make me soup every time I thought the world was ending. She'd say, 'If you can eat, you can fight another day.' I didn't understand then, but I do now." The child turned her head slowly. "Did your mom die too?" Clara smiled a little, though it wasn't a happy smile. "She left," she said simply. "Sometimes that hurts just as much." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind that fills rooms where grief has taken up residence. Outside, thunder rolled distantly over the hills. The girl finally reached for the spoon. Clara exhaled quietly, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Downstairs, the sound of heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor, measured, impatient, belonging to a man who had learned how to make silence feel like authority. Richard Hartsfield, billionaire, widower, master of the house, walked as though the ground owed him balance. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the faint hum of voices from his daughter's room. He knew that voice. The maid. The one his assistant said the child responded to. He had never asked her name, though he saw her every morning clearing plates, every evening carrying laundry with the quiet precision of someone who had been invisible all her life. He told himself it wasn't cruelty, it was habit. People who worked for him existed to make the world function smoothly. He didn't need their stories. But tonight something about the sound of that calm voice, rising and falling like a lullaby, made him stop halfway up the stairs. For the first time in months, Sophie wasn't screaming. When Clara came down later, the house was sleeping except for her. She moved through the empty kitchen, washing the last dish by hand even though the dishwasher gleamed in the corner like a silver promise. She preferred the warmth of water, the feel of doing something that mattered, however small, She rolled her sleeves up carefully, revealing the faded bruises on her forearms, and then winced as the soap touched skin too tender to forget. The overhead light flickered. She stood there staring at the slow swirl of bubbles in the sink, thinking about the way Sophie's hand had trembled when she took the spoon. Outside, a car door slammed. Clara glanced toward the window, heart tightening. Andre's old pickup truck. He wasn't supposed to come tonight. Not again. She dried her hands quickly and slipped out the back door, closing it behind her so the noise wouldn't wake the child upstairs. The air smelled of wet earth. Andre stood by the fence, shoulders hunched, eyes glassy. "You got paid, right?" he said, not bothering with hello. "Not yet," Clara answered, keeping her voice low. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not." She folded her arms over her chest. "I told you, Mr. Hartsfield pays at the end of the week." Andre stepped closer. The rain caught the light on his leather jacket. He wasn't cruel all the time, but when he was, it was like something dark slipped behind his eyes, something she couldn't reason with. "You think I'm stupid?" "I think you're drunk," she said quietly, and that was worse. His hand twitched, and for a moment she thought he would hit her again. But he didn't. He only smiled, small, mean, and said, "You'll get it soon. You always do." Then he turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints that would dry into the wood by morning. Clara leaned against the fence, shaking. The rain began to fall again, softer now, and she tilted her face upward, letting it hide her tears. Inside the house, the security lights flickered on, casting her shadow long across the lawn. Later, when she returned inside, she caught sight of herself in the glass door, a blurred reflection of a woman still standing. She straightened her shoulders, fixed her uniform, and went back to finish polishing the silverware before dawn. Somewhere above her, Sophie was finally sleeping. And for reasons Clara couldn't name, that small victory was enough to keep her moving. Richard Hartsfield, sitting alone in his office with a drink he didn't want, stared at the family portrait on the wall, the only photograph where all three of them were smiling. His gaze drifted to the doorway, to the faint sound of a lullaby still echoing in his mind. He didn't know the maid's name, but her voice had followed him, threading through the silence like a fragile promise. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows, and for the first time in years he realized how unbearably lonely a house could sound when no one in it knew how to love anymore. The morning after the rain, sunlight filtered through the wide glass walls of the mansion like something unsure of its welcome, cautious and pale. The marble floors gleamed too perfectly, reflecting a world that looked polished but felt hollow. Clara had arrived before dawn, as always, her shoes squeaking faintly against the tiles while the house still slept. She moved with quiet precision through the kitchen, laying out breakfast trays and arranging fruit no one would touch. The scent of brewed coffee filled the air, sharp and clean, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. She had barely slept, the bruise on her wrist aching like a heartbeat. Still, she pressed powder over it until the skin looked smooth again. People in houses like this didn't want reminders of pain. They wanted service with a smile. By 8, the mansion had awakened. The nanny fussed with schedules, the chauffeur reported a delay, and the chef barked orders in a voice too loud for the hour. Through it all, Clara moved like a ghost between them, invisible except when someone needed something fixed. At 9, she took the breakfast tray upstairs to Sophie's room. The child was already awake, sitting by the window in her nightgown, hair lit like spun gold. She was staring at nothing, the kind of stare that belongs to people who have learned that waiting is safer than wanting. Clara placed the tray on the bedside table and knelt to tie the slippers on Sophie's small feet. "Good morning, baby," she said softly. "How's your heart today?" Sophie shrugged. "Quiet," she murmured. "Quiet's better than broken," Clara said. "Quiet means it's resting." The girl smiled faintly, then looked toward the door. "Is Daddy coming?" she asked. Clara hesitated just long enough for Sophie to notice. "He's busy this morning," she said gently. "Meetings." Sophie's shoulders drooped, and Clara felt that familiar twist in her chest, the helpless anger at a world where children learn disappointment too young. She lifted the spoon, blew on the oatmeal, and offered it with a smile that felt like an act of defiance against the cold. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get something warm in you." Halfway through breakfast, the door opened. Richard stood there, immaculate in a dark suit, phone pressed to his ear, words sharp and fast. "I don't care what the board says," he snapped. "You tell them I make the decisions, not them." His eyes flicked toward the bed, where Sophie sat frozen, spoon halfway to her mouth. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Clara saw the faint hesitation in his expression, the crack of guilt. But then it was gone. He ended the call, slid the phone into his pocket, and nodded curtly. "Good morning." His voice was formal, distant, the tone of a man speaking to an employee, not a daughter. "Morning, sir," Clara said, rising to her feet. "I asked for coffee 20 minutes ago. I'll bring it right up. Now, please." She nodded and started toward the door, but Sophie's small voice stopped her. "Daddy?" The girl's question was barely more than breath. Richard turned, his expression softening by degrees. "Yes, Pumpkin? Can you stay for breakfast?" There it was. The plea Clara heard every morning but never dared echo. For a moment Richard looked unsure, his jaw tightening as if he might say yes. Then the mask returned. "I can't. Important call in 10 minutes. Sophie's gaze dropped to her lap. "Okay." The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara wanted to speak, to say anything that might mend the invisible rip in the air, but she knew her place. When she brought the coffee moments later, Richard was gone. Sophie hadn't moved. That night, the house was hosting a dinner, a small charity meeting, a dozen people in suits pretending generosity wasn't another form of power. Clara worked in the background, serving, clearing, smiling. From her vantage point near the door, she could see Richard at the head of the table laughing, his charm precise, practiced. The conversation floated around talk of numbers, donations, market shifts, the future of education, though not one person mentioned children by name. When she passed him a dish, he thanked her without looking up. It was habit, not humanity. After midnight, when the guests were gone and the staff dismissed, Clara stayed behind to finish cleaning the dining room. She was polishing the last glass when she heard a soft sound, a muffled sob from upstairs. She hesitated only a moment before setting the glass down and climbing the grand staircase, the one she was never supposed to use. Sophie's door was half open. Inside, the girl sat curled on the floor beside her bed, the stuffed rabbit limp in her lap. Clara knelt beside her. "What happened, baby?" "He yelled," Sophie whispered. "He was on the phone, and I went in to say goodnight, and he yelled." "Was it at you?" Sophie shook her head. "At someone else. But he looked at me like he forgot who I was." Clara brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. "He's hurting too," she said softly. "Grown-ups don't always know what to do with hurt, so they hide it in the wrong places." "Like you?" The question cut through her. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. Sophie's eyes were fixed on her, innocent but knowing. "I saw your arm," the girl said quietly. "When you helped me with my shoes, it looked like when Mommy fell off her horse." Clara swallowed hard. "It's nothing, sweetheart." "It's not nothing." Sophie leaned closer, voice trembling. "You help everybody, but who helps you?" The words landed like a confession she didn't know she was waiting for. For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. Then she smiled through the ache. "You help me, baby. Every time you eat, every time you laugh again. That's how I know I'm still doing something right." The next morning, Richard called her into his office. The room was vast, lined with books that looked untouched. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, the light from the city skyline outlining his silhouette. "Miss Johnson," he began without turning, "I need to speak with you about last night." Her stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." "My daughter was upset. She says you were in her room past midnight." Clara forced her voice steady. "She was crying, sir. I stayed until she calmed down." "That's not your responsibility. You're here to maintain order, not—" He broke off, turning sharply toward her. Not to play therapist. With respect, sir, she said quietly. Sometimes order isn't what a child needs. For the first time, his composure cracked. You think I don't know what she needs? His voice rose, sharper than he intended. You think because you clean my floors and warm her milk, you understand her better than I do? Clara didn't flinch. I think she's lonely, sir. And loneliness doesn't care how big the house is. The words hung between them like smoke. Richard's jaw clenched. That's enough. You may go. She nodded, turned, and left without another word. But as she closed the door behind her, he sank into his chair, staring at the desk as though it were the only thing holding him upright. He wanted to hate her for the audacity, but the truth was worse. He knew she was right. That evening, he watched from the hallway as Clara fed Sophie again, her tone patient, her movements gentle. The child giggled once, softly, fleetingly, and Richard felt something in his chest twist painfully. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he had made his daughter laugh. When Clara caught him standing there, he pretended to be checking the thermostat and walked away without a word. Later that night, as the house fell silent, Clara sat by the window in her small quarters behind the kitchen, holding a letter she had never mailed. It was addressed to her sister in Alabama, written months ago, folded and refolded until the edges had worn thin. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew every word by heart. It was the same plea she had once whispered into the dark. I'm fine. Don't worry. I'm surviving. She looked down at her hands, rough from bleach and soap, and wondered when survival had started to feel like surrender. Upstairs, Sophie's laughter echoed faintly. A rare sound, fragile as glass, and Clara closed her eyes. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe keeping that sound alive was the only kind of salvation left for people like her. The wind changed that week, warmer by day but restless at night, rattling the tall windows of the mansion like fingers seeking a way in. Clara noticed it first in Sophie's restlessness, the way the child began pacing instead of sleeping, as though something in the air carried a secret too large for her small body to hold. Every evening, Clara found new ways to fill the silence, stories about her grandmother's garden, songs half remembered from church, the small jokes that made Sophie hide her smile behind a spoon. But underneath the quiet rhythm of their routine, tension grew like a vine twisting through the house. Richard had been watching more often. He appeared in doorways, on stair landings, at the edge of rooms, saying little, his gaze caught between curiosity and unease. Clara felt it each time, the awareness of being seen after so many years of training herself to disappear. She pretended not to notice, focusing on the tray, the bowl, the clock ticking on the wall. But the heat in her neck betrayed her. One afternoon, the household shifted into chaos. A leak in the roof flooded part of the second floor, and contractors filled the corridors with ladders, drills, and impatient voices. Clara spent hours mopping, drying, replacing rugs. By evening, her back ached, her hands raw, yet the work gave her cover. Andre had been calling again, leaving messages that grew meaner by the day, demanding money she didn't have. She deleted them all, praying he would lose interest, but fear settled into her like dust that could never be cleaned. That night, she almost didn't go upstairs to Sophie. Exhaustion pinned her to the chair in the servants' lounge. But when she heard the faint sound of crying, she pushed herself up, because promises, once made to children, were sacred. Sophie was sitting by the window again, this time clutching a crayon drawing. It was a family, a tall man, a woman in a blue dress, and a small girl holding both their hands. The lines were crooked, the colors bright. "That's Mama," Sophie said when Clara sat beside her. "And that's Daddy, and that's you." Clara looked closer. The woman in blue had brown skin and a gentle smile. "You put me in your family?" she asked softly. "You already are," the girl replied. The words struck harder than any blow. Clara felt tears rise and quickly blinked them away, afraid the child would mistake them for weakness. She helped Sophie into bed, humming the same tune her grandmother used to hum when storms passed over their old porch roof. The wind outside howled, but the room stayed warm. Downstairs, Richard waited in the study, nursing a glass of scotch he didn't want. When Clara entered to return the housekeeping log, he motioned for her to sit. She hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the leather chair. "She's eating again," he said after a moment. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." His tone carried something like gratitude but restrained, as if kindness cost too much. "Thank you, sir," she murmured. "It's not just me. She's trying." He studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak as if you know her better than I do." Clara met his gaze. "Children show the side of themselves they think is safe." "Maybe she's learned that with me." The words were not defiance, only truth, but they unsettled him. He leaned back, exhaling. "You have a way of saying things that sound simple and leave me uncomfortable." "I don't mean to, sir." "Perhaps you should." The silence stretched, filled with the ticking of the clock and the faint smell of rain. Richard's voice softened. "Do you ever think about leaving this kind of work?" "Every day," she said. "But thinking and doing are different things." He nodded slowly, then reached for an envelope on the desk. "I was going to give this as a bonus. For Sophie's improvement." Clara shook her head. "Please don't. You pay me what we agreed." "It isn't charity." "It feels like it." For the first time, his composure slipped into something raw. "Why is pride always the armor of the poor?" She rose to her feet. "Because without it, sir, we'd have nothing left that's ours." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding herself upright. She left before he could answer. The following evening, while she prepared Sophie's dinner, a knock came at the back door. It was Andre. His smile was wrong, too calm. "I waited till late so nobody'd see me," he said. "You got my messages." "You need to go," she whispered, glancing toward the hallway. "Not till we talk." He stepped inside, the smell of whiskey wrapping around him like a second skin. "You think you better than me now? Working for the rich folks?" Clara tried to back away, but he caught her wrist, his fingers pressing the bruise until her knees weakened. "Let go," she hissed. "Please, Andre." His grip tightened. Then a voice from behind froze them both. "Is there a problem?" Richard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The scene looked almost ordinary. 2 servants, a late-night conversation, but the silence beneath it vibrated with danger. Andre released her, muttering something about misunderstanding, and slipped past, out into the rain. Richard watched him go, before turning to Clara. "Who was that man?" "No one," she said too quickly. "He looked like more than no one." "Please, sir, it's personal." "Anything that happens under this roof becomes my business." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling small under the weight of his gaze. "He used to be someone I cared for. It's finished." Richard's voice softened. "Did he hurt you?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. He stepped closer, then stopped himself. "You should have told me." "And what would you have done? Called the police? Men like him don't scare easy." "Besides, I can handle it." "You shouldn't have to. Life doesn't ask what we should or shouldn't have to, sir." She left him standing in the hall, the faint scent of bleach and rain lingering behind her. For the rest of the week he found excuses to pass by her station, to ask small questions, to confirm she was unharmed. His attention unsettled her more than Andre's threats. Pity was dangerous. Kindness could feel like another kind of cage. Yet each night when she sang Sophie to sleep, she felt his presence somewhere nearby, listening from the shadows. One evening she looked up mid-song and saw him reflected in the mirror of the vanity, hands clasped, head bowed, not in prayer, but in shame. He left before she could speak. The escalation reached its quiet peak the next morning when the household woke to police lights at the gate. Andre's truck had been found abandoned near the estate road, windshield shattered, traces of blood on the seat. The officers questioned staff, but no one knew anything. Clara answered calmly, though her pulse hammered in her throat. Richard watched her from across the foyer, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. Not of scandal, but for her. When they were alone, he said, "If he comes near you again, I'll make sure you're protected." "From what, sir? The world?" She smiled without warmth. "There's no shelter from that." That night, Sophie refused to eat, unless Clara stayed beside her. So Clara stayed, holding the spoon steady even as her hand trembled. When the girl finally slept, Clara lingered at the bedside, brushing a curl from her forehead. Behind her, the door creaked. "Miss Johnson," Richard said quietly. "I owe you an apology." She turned, startled. "For what?" "For assuming strength means safety. You're the strongest person I've met, and yet you live surrounded by danger I've never known. That's not right." Clara looked at him for a long time. "It's not about right, sir. It's about surviving long enough to see right again." Outside, the wind rose, bending the trees until they whispered like voices through the dark. In the fragile peace of that room, something shifted between them, unspoken, dangerous, necessary. Neither of them moved. The clock ticked on, and for the first time since she entered this house, Clara allowed herself to breathe without waiting for permission. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm both fragile and deceptive, a stillness that felt more like the pause before thunder than peace itself. The mansion seemed gentler on the surface, flowers replaced in the vases, sunlight returning to the long hallways, but beneath the polished air there lingered a tension, quiet and unresolved. Richard had grown strangely present, his voice softer when he spoke to Sophie, his gaze often distant as though he was learning the art of seeing for the first time. Clara noticed the change but didn't trust it. She had seen repentance before. It came like weather, sudden and unreliable. Still, she moved through her days with careful grace, tending to Sophie's lessons, polishing silver until it reflected the child's smile, cooking the meals that filled the hollow of the house with warmth it had long forgotten. It was in those small gestures that she felt something close to belonging, though she never let herself call it that. One afternoon, while folding linens in the quiet of the laundry room, Clara overheard Richard speaking to someone near the open terrace. The voice belonged to his lawyer, a man with the slick confidence of those who had never known scarcity. "You can't keep her employed, Richard," he was saying. "If the press finds out about the incident with the man, there will be questions. About security, about your judgment." Richard's reply came low but firm. "She stays. She's the reason my daughter smiles again. If the world can't stomach that, it's the world's problem." There was silence, then a sigh. "You're letting emotion cloud your decisions." "For once," Richard said, "I think that's exactly what I need." Clara froze where she stood, the sheet limp in her hands. She should have felt gratitude, but instead there was unease. Gratitude meant dependence, and dependence meant danger. That evening she found Sophie in the library, sprawled on the carpet coloring. The child looked up, grinning, a flash of sunlight through clouds. "Daddy's teaching me about constellations," she said proudly, pointing to a book open beside her. The pages glowed beneath the lamp, filled with dark skies and patterns of light. "He says Mama used to love stars." Clara smiled, sitting beside her. "Did you know," she said softly, "that in some places they say stars are the people we've loved, watching so we don't forget?" Sophie looked up, eyes wide. "Then Mama sees me?" "Every night, sweetheart." The girl tilted her head, thoughtful. "Do you think she sees you too?" The question startled Clara. She wanted to answer, but before she could, Richard entered, carrying a cup of tea. His expression softened when he saw them together. "She's been eating well," he said. "You're a miracle worker, Miss Johnson." "Not a miracle, sir," Clara replied. "Just consistency." "That might be the same thing," he murmured. For the first time, they shared a quiet laughter that didn't feel borrowed from duty. It was a moment so ordinary it startled her. A man, a woman, a child, the soft sound of life returning. but it held the weight of something neither could name. When Richard turned to leave, he paused by the doorway. "You once said, 'Loneliness doesn't care how big a house is,'" he said. "You were right." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some truth sat easier in silence. Later that night, while she cleaned the kitchen, the telephone rang. She almost didn't answer, but instinct made her lift the receiver. A man's voice rasped through static. "Andre, you think you're safe, don't you?" The sound froze her blood. "You think hiding behind that rich man makes you untouchable? I know where you are, Clara." Her breath caught. "Andre, don't, please. Just let it go." He laughed, low and cruel. "You owe me, and I don't forget debts." The line went dead. For a long time she stood there, listening to the hum of silence, the thud of her heart. When Richard appeared in the doorway, she flinched. He frowned. "What is it?" "Nothing, sir," she said quickly, wiping her hands. "Just a wrong number." He didn't believe her, but he let it go. Sleep refused to come that night. In her small room, Clara sat by the window watching the distant lights of the city flicker. She thought of Andre's voice, of how easily fear could unravel the small piece she had stitched together. Yet beneath the fear was something new. Anger, sharp and clean. Not at him, but at herself, for allowing his shadow to follow her here. She had built her life on quiet endurance, but maybe endurance alone wasn't enough anymore. When dawn came, she found Richard already awake in the study, staring at a folder of documents. "Sir," she said, hesitating at the threshold, "if you ever think I'm trouble for your family, I'll leave. No notice needed." He looked up, startled. "What brought this on?" "I overheard your lawyer yesterday." His expression darkened. "You weren't meant to." "I didn't mean to, but I did." "He's right. You don't need me here." "You're wrong," he said quietly. "We do. Sophie does." "And you?" she asked before she could stop herself. For a heartbeat, the air between them shifted. He looked away first, fingers tightening on the papers. "I'm learning," he said finally, "how to be present, how to repair what's broken. That's because of you." "I'm just a maid, sir. You're not just anything." His voice was soft, almost reverent. She felt her chest tighten with something she didn't want to name. "That kind of talk can't go anywhere," she said, forcing a small smile. "It only leads to misunderstandings." "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it leads to truth." She shook her head, retreating toward the door. "Truth has a cost, sir. And people like me can't afford it." The days that followed brought a quiet, tentative balance. Sophie laughed more easily. Richard spoke with warmth instead of command, and Clara moved through the house with a strange, unsteady peace. Yet she caught herself watching the gate each morning, half expecting a familiar figure to appear. Fear had become a habit she couldn't unlearn. One evening, as she tucked Sophie into bed, the child asked, "Are you sad?" "Why do you ask?" "Because when you smile, your eyes don't." The honesty was disarming. Clara stroked her hair. "Sometimes grown-ups hide sadness so children don't have to see it. Does it go away when you hide it?" "No," she said after a pause. "But it waits." And waiting is easier than breaking. That night, Richard found her in the dining room long after midnight, polishing silver she had already cleaned. "You never rest," he said. "Rest feels dangerous," she replied. He studied her face. "You're frightened." She wanted to deny it, but the truth rose uninvited. "Yes." "Is it the man?" She looked at him sharply. "You knew?" "I had him checked," he admitted. "He's been in trouble before. Assault, theft. I won't let him near you again." "You can't promise that." "I can try." His voice broke slightly, and in that fracture she saw not the billionaire, but a man terrified of failing the few people who still believed in him. "You've done enough," she said softly. If he comes, I'll face it. You shouldn't have to face anything alone. No one gets through life any other way. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the heat of his presence, but not so close as to cross the fragile boundary that kept them both safe. Clara, he said, her name strange and new on his tongue, you make me see the world differently. Then see it clearly, sir, she replied. See what it asks of people like me. She left him standing there among the polished glass and silver, his reflection multiplied and hollow. When she returned to her room, she closed the door gently and leaned against it, her pulse loud in her ears. She didn't know whether she was running from danger or from something she had secretly begun to need. Outside, the wind rose again, stirring the curtains of Sophie's room. In the faint glow of the hallway light, Clara saw the child asleep, hand curled around the stuffed rabbit, her breathing even. The house was still, but the stillness felt alive now, trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. And as the first drops of rain tapped against the window pane, Clara whispered a silent prayer. Not for safety, but for courage, because she sensed the calm they were living in was not peace at all, only the middle of the storm. The late autumn sky pressed itself low and tired over the estate as if the day could not be bothered to finish. And inside the house the evening carried an extra weight that settled into Clara's bones like cold. She moved through the corridors with care, each footfall a soft measure against tile worn smooth by 100 invisible lives, and the ordinary tasks of folding, polishing, and preparing cold compresses for Sophie's brow felt suddenly urgent, in a way they had never been before, as if the small acts that had stitched the family back together might fray at any careless tug. Andre's voice had been a threat on the line, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be dangerous, and the memory of it sat beneath her skin all day like a dull burn, warming and terrible. She found herself watching the window more than she had any right to, turning away when the gate opened and breathing only when the distant taillights disappeared down the drive, because the truth of living with fear was that seeing someone leave did not make them go. That evening, Sophie wanted a story she had already heard a dozen times, the tale of a little bird who could not fly until she learned to believe the wind would hold her. And Clara told it the way her grandmother had taught her, slow and steady and full of the tiny details that made the world feel safe for a moment. The child's breath at last became even, the muscles of her jaw unknotted, and Clara sat watching the slow rise and fall of a small chest, with the gratitude of someone who has learned how precious those ordinary rhythms are. It was the sort of gratitude that made her want to give everything she had and take nothing in return. When she left the room, the house seemed louder than it had any right to be. The hum of a refrigerator, the distant click of an automatic light, the hush of the library's books. And under that hum was the thin, almost metallic sound of worry that threaded her whole life lately. She did not expect the front door to open, did not expect the interruption, and yet the first sound that reached her as she reached the kitchen was a voice she knew too well and did not want to know at all. Andre moved like a man with too much claim on the world, swaggering into the kitchen with his collar up against the damp and his eyes already measuring her for the space he planned to take. And the sight of him pushed something deep into Clara like a cold hand. "You got a minute?" he asked without preamble, and he was too casual for the moment, as if their history could be weighed in the same balance as a conversation about rent. Her mouth closed around nothing. "You need to leave," she said, and the words were meant to be short and final, but his face softened into something that had once been tenderness and now lived only in habit. "We can talk money, baby." "You always said you'd help me." He stepped closer, the air between them tightening like a noose. Clara moved back toward the counter, keeping a distance that felt too small, and at the edge of her vision she saw the dark smear of bruises she had hidden with sleeves and powder, the places on her arms that remembered hands that had no right to own her. "I can't," she repeated, and the word held the weight of every night she had sat awake and thought about leaving, and every morning she had found reasons not to go. Andre smiled in the way people smile when they are about to take, not give, and his hand reached for the envelope he believed was waiting in her pocket, the money he imagined always just beyond his grasp. "Don't make me sorry I came," he said, and the undercurrent of the line pressed like a cliff. Before she could answer, the back door swung wider, and a shape blocked the pale light, tall and rigid in the doorway, and Clara's body reacted before her mind did, because the house learned its own guardians. Richard filled the frame, the suit he'd worn all day dark and businesslike, and for a moment it was not the billionaire in him that spoke, but a human sound of alarm that did not belong to privilege, but to protectiveness pure and raw. His eyes took in Andre, then Clara, and something like dismay crossed his face. The sound he made was not a question, but a chord that pulled them all taut. "Get out," he said, and the word was simple, a single order that carried the force of what he would later discover he was capable of. Andre's grin thinned. "Mind your business, man," he replied, which might have been an end if not for the way his hand found Clara's wrist, hard and quick, as if to anchor himself to something he feared losing. That quickness, an old reflex born of familiarity and ownership, was the thing that broke Clara's breath into little pieces. She tried to pull free and felt the pressure of his fingers bruise beneath her sleeve, the memory of other nights like it. Something in her chest went tight, and she wanted to scream, not at Andre, but at the world that kept offering her choices that were not choices at all. Richard stepped forward, the scotch he had been nursing slipping from his hand and clattering to the tile in a small sound that echoed like a verdict, and his voice rose in a way she had never heard before. It carried the weight of the man who had decided finally that his home could not be a place for this cruelty. "Let her go." Andre sneered and shoved Clara hard enough that she knocked against the counter, and the motion seemed to make time stutter. For a second, everything was a slow, cruel film. The tilt of the overhead light, the pattern of the tile, the edges of a photograph on the wall, the world reduced to the two of them, and the dangerous geometry of hands. Clara's head hit the counter with a dullness that sang pain through her teeth, and the spoon she had been holding skittered and rang against the sink. A clear bell in a room gone suddenly raw with potential ruin. Sophie's small voice reached them from upstairs, a frightened question that made Clara's stomach drop through her feet, and the sound of the child's name on the air was like a final test of all their choices. Andre laughed, too loudly, and while he reveled in the power of the moment, Richard moved, not like a man with threats on his tongue, but like someone who had waited too long and could not wait any longer. He pinned Andre's arm against the wall with a strength that was efficient and almost clinical, the kind that left no room for theatrics, and his face was not triumphant but simply resolved, the lines at the corner of his eyes drawn tight, as if he had been holding back the shape of a life and now refused to let it be anything but humane. "You leave now," he said, and when the man pushed back, Richard's hand tightened. There was a sound then, the thin metallic note of a police radio in the distance, coincidental and somehow perfect, and the three of them held for the beat between decision and consequence. Andre retreated with a violent energy that promised return, a promise made of threats and small cruelties, and on his way out he spat into the hallway, the gesture small and obscene and meant to wound. Clara crumpled against the counter for a long second, pressing her palms to the place where his fingers had bruised her, then looked up to find Richard watching her with an expression she could not name, part apology, part something deeper that revealed a man learning a new muscle, the muscle of taking responsibility the way the grief for his wife had not allowed him to. "Are you hurt?" he asked, the question awkward because it was not his business, until the moment it became so. She opened her mouth and closed it. Pain had a vocabulary that was private and public at once, and to expose it made one vulnerable in a world that valued invisibility. "I'm fine," she said finally, because she was practiced in the language of survival, and because the concept of fine kept the rest of life moving. But she was not fine, and the truth of that would ripple outward like a stone in still water. Someone had seen, it turned out, a neighbor who liked to watch the estate from his driveway because he liked to name the cars that came and went. And by the time the officers stepped onto the porch, their shoes whispered over the marble and the quiet of the house changed into a room with witnesses. Andre's truck had been seen driving away fast, then abandoned, and now a description hung in the soft air like a cloud ready to rain. The police took statements with the somber efficiency of people trained to hold chaos steady, And Clara found herself telling the story in small, measured sentences that felt like giving up parts of herself. And each sentence cost her something she could not name. Sophie watched from the stairs, eyes round and terrified, and in that small face Clara found once again the reason she had stayed, because someone had to be the one who kept the small things whole. The incident rippled through the staff and then through the house like a loudness everyone had been avoiding. And by morning the estate felt different, guarded. Security cameras were repositioned, new codes distributed, and a man from Richard's firm who had spoken in clipped tones about liability and reputation was suddenly in meetings within the house late at night, while Richard, pale and less certain than the world often let him be, paced the study and made calls that sounded like promises to protect. Clara accepted the measures with a guarded gratitude. She had no illusions that cameras could keep a past from following you forever, but she knew it was harder for a person to threaten what 100 small lenses could see. Still, the bruises on her arms were not erased by an alarm or by metal turning to glass, and when Sophie pressed a small hand to her forearm that afternoon and hissed at the sight, Clara had to swallow back words that would have been dangerous for both of them to say. A new complexity entered the house in the form of reporters who had somehow sniffed at scandal and found the shape of a story. A frightened maid, an absent father, a man with a history. And the article that appeared 2 days later made the estate briefly luminous in a way that neither of them wanted, placing their private hurt in a frame for strangers to view. Richard was furious at the intrusion, and more furious that his anger felt as hollow as any other. And Clara felt exposed in a way that outraged her because it traded her dignity for someone else's curiosity. She had never asked for sympathy, and the eyes on the street were not sympathy anyway, but a hunger to witness the spectacle of a life barely held together. In the nights that followed, strangers' words circled them like scavengers, even as the quiet people in the house did their work of mending, washing, folding, feeding. And Clara, who had hidden bruises with powder and scarves, found herself hiding, instead behind the ordinary tasks that made the house livable. But hiding could only last so long. When Sophie came to her one evening with a bandage clumsily wrapped around a forearm she had picked at in worry, and asked in a voice that tried not to be afraid, "Did he hurt you because he loved you?" Clara knelt and took the child's small hand and felt the tremble of it echo in her own. There are answers one must give a child that must be true and not easy. The truth in her mouth tasted of iron and salt. "No, baby," she said, holding the child as if holding could rearrange the world. "He loved what he wanted, not what was right." That's not love. Sophie's brow creased with a confusion that made Clara ache anew. Children do not parse the moral weight of adults until they are made to. The house breathed with the sound of a temporary truce. Security, police reports, adjustments, and a billionaire who had finally learned that wealth could call for different kinds of responsibility, and was trying, imperfectly, to meet them. Yet the pressure that had been building did not dissipate so much as move. It collected into a knot that clung to Clara's chest, and would not be loosed by law or cameras or kind words. The next threat would be less obvious than a shove, more insidious and loud in private, and she felt the shape of it before she could name it. A kind of debt that could not be paid with cash alone, and would demand currency of a different sort. The knowledge of that impending cost was the thing that followed her to bed that night, and as she lay there with the house settling around her like breath, she wondered which would arrive first, the reckoning or the choice to run. The house held its breath in a way Clara had never known a building could, as if every room had learned to wait for the moment something irretrievable might be put right or irrevocably broken. That evening the hush tasted of metal and of rain yet to come, and she moved through it with the small, guarded dignity of someone who has rehearsed survival so many times that it has become muscle memory, a choreography of silence, a set of movements designed to keep the fragile parts of her life from being exposed to strangers in storm alike. Sophie had been asleep early, curled under the quilt with the rabbit tucked at her chin, and for a long hour Clara stood at the doorway watching the slow rise and fall of the child's breath, feeling an ache that was equal parts tenderness and terror. Because to love a vulnerable thing means to forever keep watch for the wolf at the edge of the estate. She had just turned to leave when the back door opened with a sound too ordinary to be a herald, and Andre stepped into the warm light of the kitchen. the outline of him like a bruise in the doorway, his face set in that way that used to make her feel small and frantic and foolish for thinking she could be anything but his shadow. And in his hand, there was an envelope thick with the sort of cash that had once promised freedom and now only pressed obligation into the skin. He did not bother with a knock. He did not need one. "You were supposed to meet me last night," he said, and his voice slid across the room like oil, slick and dangerous. "I've been waiting. You've been hiding while you getting paid to look after other people's babies." Clara kept her posture even, not because she felt steady, but because steadiness kept the world from deciding she would fall apart on cue. She said nothing at first, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as a measure of his intent, and somehow the old script they had shared. Soft promises, loud apologies, softer apologies again, felt like a costume he had decided to wear that night because it fit the scene he expected. "I don't have it," she told him finally, and the words were small but precise, an attempt to keep the map of danger from widening. Andre smiled in a way that had teeth in it and stepped forward until she could feel his heat, the memory of his hands, a live wire under her skin. "You always got some excuse, Clara. Folks like you don't get to be picky. You hear me? You don't get to pick what you keep and what you leave." His fingers found her wrist before she could turn away, fingers that were used to owning space as though space owed them rent, and the pressure was an old vote in a rigged election of dominance. Clara recoiled enough to let breath in, but not enough to give him what he wanted, and the split second of silence that followed contained 1,000 small reckonings. Every night she had stayed because of a child's need. Every morning she had put on a new face. Every bruise she had learned to hide beneath the continuity of working hands. The sound of a slipper against the foyer tile distracted them both. A soft, faltering noise that turned into Sophie's small shadow at the top of the stairs. Her eyes rimmed red with sleep and fear, and the kind of clarity only children have when the kettle has boiled over in the house and they know it by sound. She must have sensed the wrongness, the off-kilter of an adult world, and she stood there with the fragile courage of someone who decides to name a danger, because naming it makes it less monstrous. "Andre!" she called in a voice that was both small and absolute, and the name carried like a bell because it belonged to the past and the present both, an echo that pulled at the edges of everyone in the room. For a heartbeat, the world paused on the hinge of choices. Andre's hand tightened on Clara's wrist, and she realized with a fierce clarity she had not felt before that her life had been a long series of small silences given away to men who used them as currency, while Sophie's presence was a light that refused to be bought or sold. Richard appeared in the doorway then, moving with a kind of deliberate slowness that had the imprint of a man who had learned the cost of haste, and his face was a map of sleepless months and new kinds of feeling that had no easy language. He did not come as a judge with a gavel, but as a human who had been awakened to the harm that had been allowed to live under his roof. And when he saw Andre's hand on Clara's arm, his voice was soft and contained and terrible in the way certainty is. "Let her go," he said, and the command had the straight, cold line of something that refused to be negotiated. Andre's grin thinned into a snarl. "You don't know who you're telling to let go," he said, and you could hear the years of petty grievances and bruised pride stacking behind each syllable as if he rehearsed his cruelty as a craft. "This ain't your problem, rich man." He shoved Clara hard enough that she hit the counter, and the world narrowed to the rough scent of soap and the coppery taste of fear. And for a breath she thought the scene would go exactly as it had a dozen times before. Bruises, apologies, the slow recruitment of shame, until Sophie, as if plucked from a place of instinct that knew more about truth than most adults, stepped between them with a resoluteness that made her small chest puff out like a shield. "You leave her alone," Sophie said, and the sentence was a kind of small, bright weapon. There was no tremor now, only the shrill courage of a child who rejects injustice by the pure weight of refusing to be cowed. It was then that Richard moved in a way Clara had not expected of him. Not because he had been taught to, but because something beneath his surface had finally broken open in the most necessary place. He grabbed Andre's shoulder and shoved him back. Toward the door, not with boastful violence, but with a force that had been deliberated into being, and as Andre lurched, he cursed and spat the worst of his smallness into the room, and the air tasted suddenly like metal. "You go now," Richard said, and his voice held no room for argument anymore, only the fatigue of a man done tolerating the intolerable. Andre stumbled out, swearing, the back door slamming behind him with the sound of a verdict, and the echo that a life that had outrun its bounds cannot re-enter without consequences. And in the heavy silence that followed, Clara leaned back against the counter, palms pressed to the place where his fingers had bruised her, trying to keep the room from spinning into a catalogue of injuries. Richard turned to her then, and there was such raw apology in his expression that Clara felt all the old ways of measuring worth shift like sand underfoot. He stepped closer, and for a second she thought he would apologize for the late hours and the oversight and for all the small ways his world had been insulated against the reality of hers, but instead he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And the question landed with the awkward force of someone asking a stranger to hand them the map of their life. "Because it wasn't my business," she replied, voice steady though her throat constricted with the image of every time she had been unseen. "And because telling don't always change things. Sometimes it just makes more noise." He lowered his head as if he had been struck by the truth of that sentence, and the silence that followed was so full it felt like a presence. The officers returned before midnight with questions sharper now because someone had seen Andre's truck, and the possibility of a charge dangled like a thin thread of hope, and neighbors whispered in corners where they thought no one could hear, and a photographer's lens had caught a smear of shame that would find its way into an email before morning. But those things were background. What mattered was a conversation that unfolded in the study, Richard's voice finally honest, not defensive, explaining the hollow that had held him since his wife's funeral, the way grief had perfected avoidance into a habit that nearly killed their family's warmth, and Clara's answers measured and raw, telling him how fear had been a constant, how seldom kindness had arrived without a price, how the house had felt like a palace whose doors were not open to everyone who lived within it. When he listened, really listened, something shifted between them that was not love in the way the novels speak of it, but a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition that two people who had occupied different orbits could meet in an honest place and begin to set the broken pieces differently. The next morning, the sun draped itself across the lawn like an offering, and there was the small public ritual of a police report, and a man taken away by officers who moved with human competence, which meant very little to the bruise on Clara's wrist, but everything to Sophie, who watched with that clear-eyed courage children have when they sense a wrong has been corrected. The story that leaked to the paper took the shape of scandal, an incident at the estate, an unnamed maid, a man arrested on suspicion, and Clara read it with a numbness that was equal parts shame and relief because the world had looked and decided to name what she had lived with in secret. She realized, with a sudden, dizzy clarity, that being seen was not always a sentence, but could be the first astonishing step toward being protected. Richard, who had not known how to cradle sorrow before, learned the new articulation of accountability. He went to the officers, answered questions, and stood, in small ways that mattered, beside her when it would have been easiest to step back. Sophie, who had become the hinge on which decisions turned, walked into the kitchen and hugged Clara with a fierceness that made both of them cry. And in that embrace, Clara felt the beginning of something like safety, a temporary and trembling promise, but a promise nonetheless. The climax did not come with fireworks or melodrama, but with the quiet corollary that truths, once given breath, do not go back into the dark easily, and as Andre's distant voice receded into the echo of the past, and the officer's shoes whispered away, Clara understood a new equation of cost and currency. She had given up silence, and silence had been the thing that cost her entire years. But the day she refused to accept ownership of that silence, she had purchased in exchange a slender, precarious freedom. The house kept its rounds, the silver was polished, Sophie's laughter returned in small, unassuming bursts, and Richard learned to be present in ways that were clumsy and human, and therefore real. And in the small private hours, Clara sat by the window, and watched the stars she once believed carried the dead watch the living. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself imagine a life in which a child's bedtime song could be a lullaby and not an alarm, and the bruises on her arms began with the slow help of time and care to fade. The days that followed did not feel like an ending, but like the slow turning of a great wheel, one that moved too quietly for anyone inside the house to notice, until it had already carried them into a gentler season. The newspapers lost interest first. Stories, it turned out, grew old faster than wounds, and by the time the last photograph of the estate faded from the front page, the world had already chosen a new headline to feed on. The silence that returned was not the sterile hush that had once haunted the mansion, but a softer thing, a breathing space in which voices could exist without fear of echoing into judgment. Clara found herself waking before dawn out of habit, yet for the first time in years she did not need to. No one waited outside in the dark. No shadow pressed its shape into the edges of her day. She dressed slowly, touching her wrist where the bruise had nearly vanished, and thought that healing had a rhythm of its own, slower than time, quieter than forgiveness. Sophie grew louder with each sunrise. The laughter that had been hesitant now filled the corridors with something bright and full of color. She had begun painting again, long strokes of blue and gold that Clara pinned to the kitchen wall because the mansion's vast white spaces had never known such warmth. Richard watched them both from the threshold more often than he joined, still learning the art of participation, but his presence had changed. It was not the restless pacing of a man trapped in his own importance, but the steady nearness of someone who had accepted that care was not a weakness to be hidden. He spoke less of business now, more of small things, the sound of rain on glass, the taste of fresh coffee, the way Sophie's drawings always seemed to find the sun. It was as if grief had finally exhaled and left behind a man willing to stand in the quiet. One evening in late winter, Clara took Sophie out to the garden where the first shoots of spring had begun to pierce the soil. The air smelled faintly of earth and promise. The girl knelt in her coat, touching the fragile green tips, and asked if plants ever got tired of waiting to be seen. Clara thought of all the years she had worked unseen and smiled. "Maybe they do," she said, "but they grow anyway. That's how they forgive the world." Sophie nodded solemnly, then looked up at her father watching from the porch. "Will Daddy grow too?" she asked, and Clara hesitated before answering. "He already has," she said, and she meant it. When night came, the house settled into its new rhythm. Clara prepared tea for herself, no longer needing to make 2 cups out of reflex, and carried it to the small balcony that overlooked the lawn. The moonlight stretched across the trimmed grass, the same light that once had frightened her because it revealed everything. And now it felt like a companion. She thought about the word home and realized that it had never belonged to a place. It was the feeling of being allowed to stand still without fear of what might come through the door. For the first time since she could remember, she felt still. Later, Richard stepped out, hands deep in his coat pockets, hesitant as if approaching a sacred ground. He said her name softly, not as an order, not even as a question. "I've been offered the Tokyo deal again," he told her. "I'm thinking of turning it down. I want to stay where I can see the seasons change." Clara smiled, not because she had anything to do with the decision, but because she understood the magnitude of it. "The world will wait," she said. "It always does. I'm not sure I deserve how patient you've been," he admitted. "Deserving has nothing to do with it," she replied. "Sometimes people just start over." They stood in silence for a while, the distance between them filled not with tension, but with respect. 2 lives once parallel, now meeting in a quiet crossing that needed no future promise to be meaningful. Inside, Sophie had fallen asleep, clutching a new storybook, the rabbit now patched and whole again, and the sound of her breathing reached them faintly through the open window. Clara listened, memorizing the rhythm the way a survivor memorizes peace, knowing it could vanish, but believing for once that it might not. When she finally turned to go, Richard said, "Clara, thank you." She paused, the words settling between them like a benediction. For what? for reminding us that kindness isn't something we earn, it's something we choose. She nodded once and disappeared into the house, her footsteps soft against the wood. In the weeks that followed, the bruises faded completely. The security cameras came down, and the papers yellowed with time. Clara kept working, but the work no longer felt like servitude. It was care, mutual and unspoken, the tending of a space where love, in its quietest form, could grow. On the last day of March, she found a letter on the kitchen counter with her name written in Richard's careful hand. It contained a new contract, better pay, fewer hours, a handwritten note that said only, "You deserve peace." She folded it carefully, not because of the money, but because of the acknowledgement it carried, then tucked it between the pages of her grandmother's old hymn book. That night, before sleep, she opened the window and let the breeze move through the room. The smell of lilac drifted in from the garden. She thought of the girl who had once fed another's child while hiding her own pain, and understood that her story no longer needed to be one of concealment. When dawn came, she woke to the sound of birds. Sophie's laughter followed a moment later, and somewhere downstairs Richard was humming off-key, the tune barely recognizable but genuine. Clara rose, tied her apron, and went to meet the day, her heart steady, her reflection in the mirror no longer a stranger but a woman who had endured and changed without losing her grace. Outside, the first light of spring touched the windows, turning them into mirrors of gold, and for a fleeting instant she imagined her grandmother's voice saying what she had always believed, that every kindness, even the smallest, finds its way home.